The night Dennis Corvo lost everything, he was smiling, right up until the second he wasn't. And that second came not with a gun, not with a threat, not with the kind of violence men like Dennis understand. It came from a woman sitting across a mahogany table in a tailored navy dress, with a flash drive in her hand and 17 months of his private accounting data loaded onto it. He never saw her as a threat. That was his only mistake, and it was the one that cost him everything. Her name was Mara Donovan. 34 years old, forensic accountant, possessor of a mind that could find a single falsified entry inside 40,000 lines of ledger the way a surgeon finds a severed nerve. She was a full-figured woman, broad-shouldered, round-hipped, the kind of presence that filled a room before she said a word. And she had spent the last year and a half making absolutely certain that Dennis Corvo and everyone around him believed she was nothing more than a soft, quiet number cruncher who flinched at raised voices. She wasn't. Nico Ferrante had hired Mara 8 months before the night everything broke open. He ran the Ferrante operation out of a glass and limestone building on West Erie Street in Chicago. Legitimate consulting on the surface, a web of protection, imports, and influence underneath. He needed someone to clean up the books after his previous accountant had quietly stolen $4 million and relocated to Lisbon. What he got was Mara, referred by a mutual contact, recommended in exactly 3 words. She finds everything. Nico was not a man who trusted quickly. He was 41. Built like someone who had never once in his life been unsure of his own weight in a room, with dark eyes that measured people the way other men measure distances, not with emotion, with precision. He watched Mara for her first 2 weeks at the firm the way you watch a new variable in an equation you haven't solved yet. She was quiet. She asked few questions. She made no mistakes. Dennis Corvo was the problem Nico hadn't solved. A rival with his own structure, his own territory on the south side, and a habit of expanding, not aggressively, but cleverly. He moved into Ferrante ground the way water moves into a cracked foundation, slowly, invisibly, and only obvious when the damage was already done. For 2 years, Nico had suspected that Corvo had someone inside his organization feeding information. He couldn't prove it. Every internal sweep came back clean. Mara found the leak in her 3rd month. She said nothing. This is the behavior that psychologists studying strategic intelligence in high-stakes environments have termed information asymmetry maintenance, the deliberate choice to accumulate knowledge without revealing its scope. Dr. Robert Cialdini, in his foundational work Influence, describes this as one of the most powerful positions a person can occupy, knowing more than the other side believes you know, and waiting for the precise moment when that knowledge becomes a weapon. Mara was waiting. The humiliation came on a Thursday evening in November. Nico had called a joint dinner, a formal, cold peace meeting with Corvo and 4 of his lieutenants, intended to negotiate a territorial boundary dispute before it required other solutions. The venue was Salvatore's, a private room in the back that smelled of aged wood and expensive wine. Mara was present as Nico's financial representative, there to review the terms of any proposed arrangement. Dennis Corvo arrived with a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. He was 53, silver-haired, prosperous-looking in the deliberate way of men who need everyone in the room to know they have money. He shook hands, he poured wine, and then, 15 minutes into dinner, he looked at Mara across the table with the specific expression of a man who has decided that dismissing someone publicly is the cheapest way to neutralize them. "I have to ask," he said, loud enough that the table went quiet. Who exactly thought it was appropriate to bring the help to a negotiation? He let his eyes travel over her with the particular cruelty of a man who has learned that attacking a woman's appearance in a room full of men costs him nothing. "Though I suppose if the finances aren't working out, at least you've got something to seat at the buffet table." The laughter came first from his lieutenants, the automatic reflexive laugh of men who understand that agreeing with the boss is always safer than hesitating. 2 of Nico's own men looked at the tablecloth. The sommelier quietly found a reason to step out. Mara looked at Dennis Corvo. She didn't flush. She didn't look at Nico. She picked up her wine glass, took a single sip, and set it down. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't realize we were opening with performance reviews. I'll save mine for the appropriate time. Corvo smiled wider, the smile of a man who believes he's been handed a stage. No, please, tell me what skills you bring to a table like this. I'm genuinely curious what Nico thinks he's doing. Reading, Mara said, mostly. Silence. Then Corvo laughed and turned back to Nico, and the dinner moved forward, and nobody in that room understood yet what they had just witnessed. John Gottman, after 4 decades of studying human interaction, identified contempt as the single most corrosive force in any dynamic between two people, not because it expresses anger, but because it communicates a fundamental belief in the other person's inferiority. What Corvo had done to Mara in that room was not casual cruelty. It was a structural declaration. You do not matter here. You cannot harm me. You are not someone I need to account for. He would spend the following 6 weeks learning exactly how wrong that declaration was. Nico said nothing at the table. He watched Mara's face after Corvo's comment, the stillness of it, the complete absence of collapse, and filed something away behind his eyes that he didn't examine until later. What Mara had found in month 3 was this. Dennis Corvo had a man inside the Ferrante payroll, a logistics coordinator named Vincent Sharp, who had been quietly photographing internal documents and forwarding them through a chain of encrypted messages to a Corvo-controlled address. More importantly, Mara had found the money, the payments to Sharp, routed through 4 shell companies and a charitable foundation registered in Delaware, all of it traceable if you knew where to look. She had documented everything. She had said nothing. She had also, in the months since, used her access to the Ferrante financial architecture to build something else, a parallel record. Every transaction Corvo's operation had run through legitimate Chicago banking infrastructure for the past 3 years, cleaned, documented, cross-referenced against public filings, not illegal to compile, not illegal to possess, devastating if placed in front of the right people at the right moment. She had been deciding when that moment was. The moment arrived on a Tuesday in January, 6 weeks after the dinner at Salvatore's. Corvo had made his move, not gradually this time, but in force. He presented Nico with a buyout offer delivered through lawyers, backed by the implicit threat that refusing it would result in certain financial irregularities in the Ferrante operation being forwarded to the IRS. The irregularities were real. Corvo had obtained them through Sharp. The threat was credible. Nico called a meeting. His lawyers, his 2 senior men, Mara. The mood in the room was the particular quiet of people who understand they are looking at a serious problem. Nico sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man running calculations he doesn't like the results of. Mara set a folder on the table. Before we discuss his offer, she said, there are some things about Dennis Corvo's financial structure that I think are relevant. She had prepared 17 pages, shell company registrations, transaction histories. The Delaware Foundation, which existed on paper to fund youth baseball programs and had never spent $1 on youth baseball. The payment chain to Vincent Sharp, documented back 14 months with dates, amounts, and corresponding events, every payment coinciding precisely with a Ferrante internal meeting or document movement. And at the back of the folder, a single page, a draft disclosure letter already formatted for submission, addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She had not sent it. She was presenting it now because she wanted Dennis Corvo, who was going to be called into this meeting in 20 minutes, because Nico's lawyers had already arranged it under the assumption they were walking into a capitulation, to see it for the first time in a room where his options had already been removed. He made his threat assuming we had nothing on him, Mara said. He's been operating under that assumption for 8 months. I've been working under a different one. He had made exactly one mistake that night in November. He was about to find out what it cost. Dennis Corvo arrived with 2 lawyers and the satisfied expression of a man collecting something he considers already his. He sat down. He looked across the table, and he saw Mara Donovan sitting there with 17 pages in front of her and the specific stillness of a person who has already finished the fight and is simply waiting for the other side to understand. She placed the folder in front of his lead lawyer without a word. She watched him read. She watched the sequence move through Corvo, the initial dismissal, the small frown, the page turn that accelerated, the moment his lawyer leaned over and said something quiet into his ear, the moment Corvo's face lost the practiced confidence it had worn for the dinner at Salvatore's and every meeting before it. The denial, the calculation, the particular stillness that is not composure but its opposite. The stillness of a man whose architecture is collapsing and who does not yet have a response prepared because he never imagined he would need one. "Where did you—" he started. "Reading," Mara said. "Mostly." The silence after that sentence lasted 4 full seconds. Nobody in that room laughed. Nico spoke then, for the first time in the meeting. He looked at Corvo with the flat, precise attention of a man who no longer has a problem. "Vincent Sharp has been removed from the payroll. The disclosure letter goes out at 5 o'clock today if the buyout offer isn't formally retracted in writing within the next 2 hours. The financial irregularities you were planning to forward, those are already being addressed by our legal team, so that particular card is off the table." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "You should go." Corvo left. His lawyers followed. What remained of his expansion into Ferranti territory was quietly dismantled over the following 3 weeks. The Delaware Foundation was audited by the IRS 9 months later. Dennis Corvo spent the next 2 years in litigation, and he spent those 2 years knowing exactly who had built the trap, and knowing that he had handed her the tools to do it the night he looked across a table at Salvatore's and decided she was no one. Afterward, when the lawyers had packed up and the room had emptied except for the 2 of them, Nico stood at the window with his back to her for a long moment. Then he turned. In his 2007 book, The Anatomy of Evil, forensic psychiatrist Michael Stone observed that the most formidable people are not those who display their power openly, but those who have learned to make it invisible until the precise moment it becomes necessary. What Nico Ferrante was looking at, standing in that conference room on a Tuesday in January, was something he hadn't encountered before. Not a person who performed strength for an audience, but someone who had spent 8 months building something decisive in complete silence for no audience at all. "You knew about Sharp in month 3, he said. "Yes. You didn't tell me. I needed more, and I needed to know whether the threat would come from Corvo directly or through the operation. It did both. That made the documentation cleaner." He looked at her for a long moment with the same precise, measuring attention she had watched him deploy on everyone else for 8 months. "The dinner at Salvatore's," he said, "after what he said to you. I heard you the first time," Mara said. "I didn't need you to say anything." "I know." He picked up the folder from the table, looked at the first page, set it back down. "I said something wrong about you once. To Petrov, 6 months ago. That you were too soft for this work." He said it without decoration, the way men say things they have already decided to stop believing. "I was trying to solve the wrong problem." Some connections between 2 people don't arrive gradually. They arrive in a single moment of clear recognition, what John Gottman calls turning toward, the instant a person stops calculating what is safe and simply moves in the direction of what is real. Nico Ferrante, who had been calculating since he was 17 years old, was looking at a woman who had just dismantled a 2-year threat in a Tuesday afternoon meeting and described her entire method as mostly reading. The distance he had maintained for 8 months felt, suddenly, like a room he no longer needed to live in. He offered her the chair beside his at the table. Not as assistant, not as employee, not as someone he intended to protect, as a partner, as an equal. The offer was stated simply, the way serious things usually are between serious people. She accepted, not because he had shielded her. He hadn't needed to, not because he had answered what Corvo said at Salvatore's. She had answered it herself, 6 weeks later, in the only language worth speaking. But because he was the first person in a very long time who looked at what she actually did, understood its full weight, and said so out loud. The world has always had a weakness for confusing gentleness with the absence of power. It is a confusion that tends to be expensive. If Mara's patience, the way she let Corvo build his own trap and then simply closed it around him, felt like something true to you, hit the like button. And if you want the next story, subscribe. The next one is about a woman who walked into a room she wasn't supposed to survive and walked out the only person still standing.